This is Pete Rollins, and this episode of Homebrewed Christianity is brought to you by Theology Beer Camp. This is an event where you'll see me humiliate Trip Fuller, where you'll see me make him cry and pray to his God for salvation. Is that what you wanted?
Well,
Trip?
I mean, you can't sponsor your own podcast, but if you live in Denver or you live in Oklahoma City,
yeah,
or anywhere near it this August,
and they're in America, yeah.
Yes, they are.
They're the two American places.
Two American places.
Yeah.
We're going to have Theology Beer Camp in August, and people should clearly come.
Oh, yeah.
Because, you only live once.
It was supposed to be called Theology Gin Camp, but I was overruled.
You were overruled. That's
going to be the next one.
Well, everyone has things on their wish list. But go to theologybeercamp.com and come hang out with us this summer. And maybe I'll cry. But it'll probably be because if y'all have never seen Pete at karaoke, then
we have something in common, because I have never seen me do karaoke either.
Really?
Yep.
It was hard to watch yourself. Don't worry, we'll videotape it. What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, which is the one you're listening to
currently in your ears,
in your ears. That's right, Nathan, and you're going to get to hear from Frederick Ware. That's right. He is a professor at Howard University's Divinity School and the author of African American Theology, an Introduction. So this is like an introductory audio introduction to
the introduction
to African American theology.
Amazing.
The book is excellent. It's super wonderful, easy to read, and well worth getting. Like, if you're a theology nerd and you're interested in African American theology and its relationship to other types of theology, the unique way it connects African American experience to theological reflection, then not getting this book would support a life decision. And after you hear this conversation, I'm sure you will be on it. The other thing I was going to say in the interview, you get to hear him work through the way he connects to different thinkers and people that have been on the podcast before, like Eboni Marshall Turman was on with Adam. Mm-hmm. They did that episode a while back. He was a student of Sallie McFague, so he talks about her and a number of other recent podcast guests. So on top of being like an introductory one, it's one where he connects what he's doing and gives shout outs to other theologians and such. So if you're a regular listener, dots will get connected.
That's always a satisfying experience.
I think so, because then you feel like you're making progress in that ever ongoing journey of nerdiness. And in one part, I'm optimistic, Nathan, about you liking this element, where I'm asking him kind of the way a very particular experience, right, of African Americans' religious experience being connected to, or historical experience being connected to, religious and theological reflection. And he has this thing he does about how no one exists in the abstract, so the concept human or just anthropos is problematic,
right?
And he starts talking about anthropology and the way your cultural, historical, situated embodiedness has a giant impact on the way it frames your theological reflection and conclusions, and the problem of people thinking there's an essentialized, abstracted human.
Well, I can't wait.
I know.
Can't wait to listen to it.
I know.
I'll have to just live tweet me listening to the episode so you can get my full reaction in real time.
Yes. So be prepared. Remember, the incarnation was particular, and so are you.
I'm going to put that on a shirt or something.
You should. I mean, who doesn't like sophisticated theological shorthand on T-shirts? People are like, "What's up with that?"
I know. We should totally start that.
Yeah, here's
it's like
the
that.
thing.
What was that Stephen
You know
Colbert
what T-shirts
book? I'm America.
mean?
And
you have to remember to ship them.
That's true.
That's the biggest problem with T-shirts.
Yeah,
I make them, and then
you just they sit in a box in your garage
because I'm like, if I tell people about it, then I'll have to mail it.
So the other way you can get some of these T-shirts is by showing up to some of the things that we'll be at,
there you go. Theology Beer Camp is happening in Denver in OKC, and then we're going to be a Wild Goose Festival in July.
That's right.
In the mountains of North Carolina.
That's the least North Carolina sounding way to say the mountains of North Carolina.
we're going to go out to the mountains of North Carolina.
There we go. That's more like it.
Man, when I eat barbecue, it better be pork and it better have vinegar in it.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's how North Carolina rolls. But there are 3 different barbecue sauces in North Carolina. And it's a central part. Well, whether or not it has mustard, and whether or not it's more like clear with the vinegar, and then the one that has more of the tomato stuff in it.
There you go. There's all 3.
And there are 3 different areas, and people like to fight. And I don't like that type of binary.
Yeah.
Well, the way I do my barbecue.
I'm open and affirming with my barbecue sauce.
I like to treat all 3 barbecue sauces like a person of the Trinity.
That's right.
I love them all equally and fully. And sometimes it just depends on what you're putting it on.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is the appropriate personal matcher right there. Like sometimes you need the sun. Sometimes it's time for the Holy Spirit. And in all things, may there be cheese and carbohydrates on the side.
Praise the Lord.
North Carolina Life Lessons. Yeah. So, and if you're coming to Wild Goose, which it would be dumb not to, because where else are you going to camp with that many people that are that awesome and have tons of art, spirituality, and music and goodness, and plus homebrew Christianity. We got promoted to the main stage this year, so
nice.
This might be a crescendo of festivals throughout all human history.
All of them crescendoing to this moment right here.
Yeah.
Where people really don't want to miss this.
Where people that are normally at the main stage avoiding the Homebrewed Christianity podcast have their afternoon interrupted. So I'm just planning. I'm gonna bring the goods. Their afternoon's gonna get theological, and they're gonna tell me thank you after, either for finishing or for what I for what I bring.
I mean, I feel like interrupting their narrative is exactly what the gospel does. So
that's what Walter Brueggemann says,
right? So I think that you should totally do that.
Yeah. So there you go.
Be there.
Be there. Also, if you're not a member of Homebrewed Christianity, then you should join homebrewedcommunity.com. We got a new High Gravity series, which is like an online interactive learning experience on reading the Bible. How a theology nerd reads the Bible. We're going to be doing that. So you can join, or you can go to the website and just join the class. But, if you just join the group, and then when the class is over, you don't get to hang out with the internet with your friends on the internet. But if you're a member, you just save money and can download old stuff and lots of cool things. And guess what? You have new friends.
Huge group of people.
You have new friends.
We're super nerdy and are willing to talk and answer questions about anything.
Correct. Just seems excellent. Excelente. And this week, we're having an Epic Reads group meeting.
This is correct.
We're reading.
Although, by the time this comes out, it's probably already happened.
Or it just happened. But either way, if you're a member and missed it, you can just download it right out of our group. All right, so go to Homebrewed Community. I greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate all your support, because you may not believe this, but putting out large numbers of podcasts on a consistent basis is a time-consuming activity.
This is true. And having 3 children, one of them, which is like 3 months old, is also a time-consuming activity.
That's also true. But, if y'all are listening to this later in your life, because I'm dead, and you're like, I'm going to listen to my dad's podcast to remember him. Every minute I spent with you was better than a number of minutes I spent apart from you.
Aw.
Yeah. Not all of them. Because there are things like, never mind. I was going to make a joke about time spent with their mother to gross them out, but I'll save all my post-mortem conversations with my children for later. Because
we got to get we got to get introduced to African American theology.
Yeah, we're going to do that right now. So buckle your theological safety belt. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear from Frederick Ware, who is the Associate Professor of Theology at Howard University School of Divinity, right there in Washington, D.C. And he has a book called African American Theology, An Introduction, which surprisingly given the title, is an actual introduction to African American theology. It's a wonderful read. It's easy to read and then see just how unique in a particular type of theological inquiry African American theology is. So for those of you that enjoyed some of the previous episodes that dealt with different parts of Black theology versus African American theology, the James Evan episode, or when Adam Clark was talking about it and stuff, like this is an excellent first book to read, and I'm just super pumped that you're here, Dr. Ware, so thank you so much. So maybe we could begin by you telling us a bit about how you came to be a theologian.
That's a long, short story, but I'll try to give a short version of it. I always wanted to study in theology or religion, and I just grew up in a very, very religious setting, a religious home, not unlike some people who have the experience of growing up and they go to church every Sunday or go to church several times during the week. So church was a central part of my life. And when I got to be a teenager, I began to have certain questions about things I was hearing, things I was witnessing. Mm-hmm. So I guess I was a budding theologian at the time, just having more curiosity and wanting to better understand what we believe and why we believe, why we do the things that we do. And I acknowledged my calling to the ministry at a very young age, just turning 18 years old. Went to college with the intention that I was going to prepare myself to go on to seminary. And I just followed that track since being a teenager. Mm-hmm.
So what were some of the first questions that you had that drove you all the way through graduate school? Because I know that, theologians over time, you end up dealing with all sorts of different questions, doctrines, engaging different dialogue partners. But there's usually a question or two that lingers at the heart of anyone that has that type of sustained inquiry.
I was born and came of age at a very unique or special time. Very late into the baby boom in 1961. And I have recollections from childhood of the civil rights movement. And as the civil rights movement waned and we went from civil rights to Black power, and I did have older siblings who were a part of that, being a part of the integration of schools, things were in much of a wane in the 70s, and the issues seemed to change significantly in the church. Whereas you had in the 60s, much of the discussions around civil rights. In the 70s, the emphasis shifted to other things, such as moral majority became really big at the time in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And so those pressing issues about social justice were really not at the forefront anymore. And I was someone very young who witnessed it and began to feel that shift and change as a young person participating in the church. And I saw that these issues were still very important and had to be addressed. And I wasn't quite satisfied with the type of preaching that I was hearing. I guess I was at an age where I was just questioning things in life, why we do what we do, and some of the things that we claimed. And I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and Pentecostalism was not as large as it is now. And so it was to be a part of a marginalized group. But since then, numbers have changed. It's a very large movement now, and it's somewhat popular to be Pentecostal charismatic, but at the time it was not. And so I did have certain questions about things that we did that made us stand out and look very different from other Christian believers.
So when you came to writing an introductory text like this, what was the motivation and conversation around writing an introduction to African American theology, and who was the audience that inspired it?
So when I wrote the book, it was nothing that I really dreamed of myself that I wanted to do, but it had just simply been a part of my teaching for a very long time. I started teaching in 1997, and one of the very first courses that I taught was Black Theology. And I had students who were taking it, and they were hearing about James Cone and other Black theologians for the very first time. And they had a lot of questions, and they're far removed from the 1960s. This is in the 1990s. So there's entirely different type of political and social context at the time. So as I did this over the years from my teaching, trying to be innovative, creative, trying to field the questions of students who were hearing about this for the first time, the textbook was something that was on the back burner for my mind for a long time. And I just happened to have the dean who gave me my first job was now working with this publisher, Westminster John Knox Press. And he contacted me and asked me, was I interested in doing the book? And of course, I was interested in doing the book because I had been doing this for quite some time. And it became a way for me to share with audiences beyond my students, different ways of looking at theology and how this type of theology can find connections with other forms of Christian theology. Some persons who did theology back then, as well as they do now, in terms of Black theology, don't always make an intentional effort to connect with other Christian groups. And so I wanted to show how this type of theology has some type of connection to other Christian groups.
Mm-hmm. So how would you, early in it, you described freedom as the overarching theme throughout African American theology. And the notion of freedom as you develop it isn't a kind of individualistic notion of freedom or freedom as a lot of people could easily mishear it. So can you describe how you understand freedom as this overarching theme in the text?
Well, I wanted to state an overarching theme as one way of tying it all together because there's so many separate studies, and it's not always a good sense of how the whole field fits together. Mm-hmm. And I focused on this theme of freedom because it's a theological theme, a theological category that is looking at God as the one who models freedom. How do we act? How do we go about acting in the world? And God is an example of freedom. How do we act? So I looked at it as a theological category. And then secondly, it's a social political category that's a part of the history and heritage of African Americans in the United States, where you read through the literature, it's quite obvious that that's a theme of persons trying to overcome servitude or second-class citizenship, seeking to have freedom. And it's also a very political concept in the United States as we talk about freedom as something that we strive to have and enjoy as citizens of a democracy. So I thought, well, this is a good way to bring it all together and to see the various streams that feed into this type of theological reflection. Mm-hmm.
So when you are describing the methodology and the history of African American theology, how do you understand the role of the Black experience in America being a source or place or situation for theological reflection?
Black experience it can be complex. It's not always seen as complex, but it's a part of America itself. And there's a certain way that the nation has interpreted itself, its identity, and its history. And in order to have a full sense of who we are as people in America, we have to include that aspect of the experience. It's very difficult to talk about it because it's a history that has some brutality and exploitation, some hardships involved in it. For example, I had only one living grandparent as a child when I grew up, and my grandmother never could talk about slavery. She never could talk about segregation. And she was someone who grew up actually in that system. She was born in 1899. We'll talk about the math of that some other time. But my grandmother was born in 1899, and various things she couldn't talk about. And in the 1970s, Alex Haley's Roots became a television miniseries. And we watched Roots, sitting around the television watching it. My grandmother could not watch that show with us. She couldn't watch it. So that's one indication of how painful the history is for those who are African American, and then those who are not African American, but still find it very difficult to talk about the history of race in the United States. Mm-hmm. But in order for us to really move forward, we have to deal with that past.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just thought the way you handled it, the book was great, and I think the other side of it for me is just a kid of white Southerners that have been here forever. Is I don't know how a white American theology would work in dealing with race and the shared experience of suffering and injustice and everything that well. It's one of those issues that and maybe you can speak to this, that right there, it's not like a white American that wrote a systematic theology book is somehow going to have 2 chapters in the method explaining how our own participation and inheritance of a sick and twisted system impacts our theology going forward. Right. And I think that's problematic in a lot of ways. And oftentimes for me, it's seen in the creative and liberating work done in theologies that do locate themselves in histories and in context, as opposed to seeing systematic theology as this static set of 7 really cool questions Christians have discussed, A, contextual and A, historical throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I introduced the book, I try to give a little background of why we do theology the way that we're doing it, and to try to give the reader a sense of how Christian theology has evolved over time. The great, outstanding theologians in Christian history were not systematic in the way that we are systematic today. Mm-hmm. They were dealing with issues that were emerging at that particular time, and they were actually doing what we will call today contextual theology, very focused on situations that were taking place at the time that the church had to respond to. And only later generations came up with some way of trying to systematize their work, but they were actually responding to situations. They were situational theologians. They weren't writing great long treatises or theses. They were dealing with problems at that particular moment that required some response from the church. So I want to give the reader in the very beginning some sense of how theology has developed over time. Why do we have a set of questions that we feel like this is how theology has to be done? So I wanted to give a little bit of background going back to the Reformation period, mm-hmm. and how in the Protestant Reformation you have persons who are incorporating principles of rhetoric and logic in order to create categories for doing Christian theology. So I wanted the reader to have a sense that in one way this is a bit arbitrary. And if we're going to excel and do theology, we have to look at context, situation, as well as feel a bit of liberty and freedom to go beyond just the categories that have been given to us. We may have to formulate new categories in order to analyze current situations. But I wanted to give the reader a little bit of historical background to see, well, how did theology come to where it is today? And then when I do my own work, I specify certain categories for doing African American theology and try to simplify the categories by giving alternative namings So rather than saying ecclesiology, I talk about moral life and community in order to give a clear focus on what I want to emphasize that comes through this type of contextual theology.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we could, you could share a bit just even how you kick off part 3 in discussing God, because if you took half of the subheadings, they sound like a systematic theology, and the other half are clearly not going to be seen in outline of Schleiermacher or Calvin or something. Rather, you can see the existence and attributes of God, and everyone just starts, oh, okay, yeah, I know how that works. So can you describe how the conversation around God is both contextual and engaging in, you bring that context and reflection into engaging the conversation that's been going throughout the history of the church?
Beginning with the chapter on God, it's systematic because it's methodical. I go step by step. I try to analyze what I think is the basic components. If someone is thinking in an analytical sense about God, so yeah, I do talk about existence and attributes. That seems to be very basic. But I wanted the reader to have some way of connecting with the larger discussions about God. So existence and attributes is not just something limited only just in the African American context, but for persons who are in other situations, people in other backgrounds, people living under a different set of conditions may think about, well, who is God? Does God exist? And what is God's character like? So those are not questions that are just specific to African Americans, but something very generally that other people can connect with. And then in that same chapter to show how have African Americans answered those type of questions. Mm-hmm. Who has God been to them? Which might be different than who God has been to other people in other type of situations, but still using language that helps people to have a conversation and a dialogue across the range or the barriers of their experience.
Mm-hmm. So what are the answers to the question, who is God, that are you saw as the most powerful contributions to make, the ones that when thinking of your own experience and research into the life of African American church, that you wanted to feature, highlight, and give text to what's been voiced?
I think who is God? God represents, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, a model of action, a model of agency, one who has power, who's able to accomplish purpose and goal. But power is balanced with love. That the defining feature of God is not so much that God is powerful, but when God decides to act, the ultimate expression of God's action is through love. Mm-hmm. So God creates a world and has a relationship with this world. And the world being of such value to God that God goes to great lengths in order to save it. And us being a part of this world to actually save and to redeem us. So God represents power, but it's power that's exercised through this type of love. And I think that's a redeeming quality. So when God is reflected upon in African American context, at least for me and the way that I've heard other people express it, they use a term that God is a waymaker. Mm-hmm. And I've heard it so much, but haven't really read a lot about it in terms of reflection, that God is the waymaker, that God makes it possible when persons come to a point of a dead end. It appears to be a dead end, or they have very limited options. God, as well as faith in God, provides them with options that they did not have beforehand. And I think that's one way of looking at it from the African American context, about how God provides us with certain possibilities that if you look at it only in a very narrow, limited sense in terms of what life seemingly offers, it would be very dismal and a life that is without hope. But God offers us possibilities to overcome situations. And then even when some situations are not completely ameliorated, God makes it possible for us to survive and to live through it, and for us to have some quality of life, even when we don't experience a full liberation in this present moment. And that's what a lot of womanist, African-American womanist theologians emphasize, that if it's not an ultimate liberation event that takes place, God makes it possible for us to survive and to thrive in situations that, by all appearances, would not suggest that we could actually survive or thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both that notion of God as waymaker and your emphasis on God's solidarity, work in the world, but God's solidarity with the oppressed, both of those, to me, kind of emphasize that in the doctrine of God is the God who acts, and it's the God who takes sides, and it's the God who comes to be with us. And while those are categories that, any Christian theologian would say something like that, the shaping power they give to the totality of the doctrine of God seems to function in a more emphatic way.
Mm-hmm.
So when you describe using that image as like waymaker and the way it comes out of the life of the church and, hearing it, and I'm reminded, which if this is a new episode for you listener, you could go back. Monica Coleman was on the podcast talking about her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, which explores that theme quite a bit. And I'm interested in how, as a theologian, you take the tradition, the text, and also noticing images that exist in the community and are being picked up, and how they become theological. Because that is I don't know, it's an act that's going on more and more in theology, but it's also one where you could easily see it shifting doctrines in ways people become uncomfortable, or they morph into ways that people go, yeah, maybe you should have picked a different thing we were all saying.
When I did my doctoral studies, it was at Vanderbilt University, and one of my professors was Sallie McFague, and she said something during one of our sessions with graduate PhD students that has impressed me since that moment, and has been a part of my theological work.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of demythologizing where it's very difficult and challenging today for people to imagine that God actually works in the world, that God is actually present with us. And I think, based upon what she was trying to explain to us as PhD students, that after you have deconstructed and after you have analyzed it, you have to put it back together again. You have to remythologize the text. So as someone like Rudolf Bultmann demythologizes the text, to analyze it, and you strip it down to its very basic components, then you have to reassemble and put it back together. So where the language of Christianity now has potent symbolism in the way that it had for these early believers. So you have these early believers who are facing great obstacles. They're
mm-hmm.
facing great challenges. They're not like people today who can be very comfortable in the U.S. where they can go to an air-conditioned auditorium and sit very comfortably and listen to a sermon that soothes them and reassures them. These early believers are facing severe challenges. Christianity is not a popular movement. It's treated as a movement of mercy. Risk death and be a part of this. So if we are talking about God today, we have to recapture that language that was potent and powerful for them, that made them take these risks. And so when I do theological work, I'm thinking about how do I take this language that we have received and explain it in such a way to today's audience that they can power of the symbols in the same way that these first believers did, and that they would be willing to take risk as well and to do something courageous, that faith would be courageous, a courageous act as opposed to just simply being something of pursuing self-interest or just your own private personal devotion, but taking on risk. And what I like to emphasize in theological work is how theology makes connection with real life, that we are doing some very heavy lifting intellectually. We're dealing with big ideas, but at the end of the day, we have to have theological work that will feed into and that will inform us in terms of how we should act and what we should do, how we should treat each other.
Mm-hmm. So you spend some time in the middle of the book before you get to, straightforward, more Christological reflection, looking at anthropology and religious experience. You do human being, religious experience, suffering and salvation. And I'm interested in what the way in which the image of blackness as a symbol helped you reflect on anthropology in ways that it's applicable to anthropology in general, and then like the unique way of thinking through blackness in African American theology.
What I like to emphasize, I hope that the reader will actually intuit this, or if it's not stated in an explicit way, that the reader would actually intuit it. But the way that we exist as human beings is through our particularity. No one exists in the abstract. As Howard Thurman says, in order for someone to be everywhere, they must first be somewhere. And that we're actually creatures that live in space and time. We're actually grounded. So our existence is lived in the particular. But we have had some theologians that want to deal with the human experience purely in the abstract way. Mm-hmm. The incarnation, when God comes into the flesh, it is particular. It is in the particular person who lives in a particular time. He's among a particular group of people. He's living under a particular set of circumstances. So the incarnation is one model of how we can reflect upon human existence and what God does through the human existence. So when God does come in the flesh, God comes in the flesh as we experience our existence in the particularity. Mm-hmm. And in that moment of particularity, begins to expand it and bring into that moment of our existence a possibility that is much greater than what we can have imagined. But the mistake that many theologians make is that they try to deal with the human experience in its universal dimension, which is not very instructive. It's not very potent. It's not very liberating theologically, because that's not the way that even God deals with the human experience. Mm-hmm. God even deals with the human experience in its particularity. So when Christ comes into the flesh, it's not the human flesh in general. Christ comes into the flesh in particular. And one way that we see the radical love and the hospitality of God, that is of Jesus, is by someone who comes as a Jew and begins to offer something to people well beyond just the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So the Apostle Paul, in his evangelistic work, he's convinced that God is working and doing something great in the world because you have non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, who are coming into this thing of salvation. So it starts in a particular way, but it has the possibility of bringing other people into this experience, or the experience can convey certain meanings to people well beyond just the people who have initially had those experiences. So as we talk about African American experience, I hope the reader will see that there are certain things that have happened in this form of human experience or human existence that can be meaningful to people who are actually outside of this social context, to see, well, what has God done within this particular moment as human beings have lived in this era? So there could be lessons that can be learned, insights that are gained. And I think that's basically what we do as human beings. We have a special skill of intersubjectivity, where we imagine or we think about what life is like for someone else. What is life like from another perspective? What is it like if someone is in a different culture at a different time? And so we're always learning from each other. We learn from each other in terms of our particular unique experiences. And it can be very radically transforming when we gain something from another human being's experience. So I'd like to emphasize as a theologian that when we look at the incarnation, God comes in a particular form. And it's from that particularity that it expands and draws other persons into it.
Mm-hmm. And I think the example of the incarnation and in the way in which often that doctrine became a means by which Christian theologians denied the Jewishness of Jesus, which has had rather horrible historical consequences. And also I think that a lot of Christian preaching, when it doesn't recognize that there is no abstract human or abstract faithful person, or when we abstract our situatedness in our own context from what's being described theologically, we distance the life of the community from our proclamation and really like God's own embrace of the fullness of our own context and pain and suffering, and it has detrimental consequences, regardless, I think, of where in church history we've seen people do it. It leads to us denying reality and wanting to affirm a truth about humanity no one's ever been, the abstract human.
When I wrote the manuscript for the book, I did not have the privilege of reading a publication that by Eboni Marshall Turman, and she had just recently published a revision of her doctoral thesis, and it deals with this whole thing of incarnation and how she constructs or proposes a womanist ethic based upon the incarnation. But Eboni Marshall Turman's work, I wish I had her book available to me when I was working on my manuscript to say a little bit more about incarnational theology and how that helps us to do contextual theology. But what she does, and I hope I represent her work well, is that when the Chalcedonian definition was formulated, it represented how Christian thinkers were bringing together, harmonizing Jesus's humanity and Jesus's divinity. And this holding together or bringing together of divinity and humanity is instructive, she says, for how we can understand ourselves as being whole people, whole persons, that there are aspects of our personhood that we should not seek to keep separate, but they should be woven together to give us a sense of the whole. And that's a model of wholeness for us. I hope I represent her well in terms of what our own work has been. Now, to say that you have Christians that have separated out Jesus's Jewishness and have dropped that element from him, that's true. And it's been a detriment to us since that time. But there are other, I think, theologians who have addressed it now and trying to recover that and to see, well, how does it help us to do better theology today when we do acknowledge that Jesus is a Jew and that in order to understand what he's actually doing, we actually have to understand that Jewish heritage that he possesses as someone who is teaching and preaching in that moment, because he's speaking from a certain context. As one of my friends always says, that Jesus did not have a New Testament. The only thing he had was the Hebrew Scriptures. And if we really want to understand who Jesus is, we have to really see how those Hebrew Scriptures informed his thinking. He comes out of that Jewish heritage.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, when you deal with the questions of evil, suffering, redemptive suffering, theodicy, these type of things, they're set in the context of the African American experience in our history, and often when those questions get picked up, it becomes a philosophy problem around theodicy and power, or it's dealt with in like post-Holocaust theology or something like that. Can you describe the way in which the experience of the Black church in America reframes the way we ask questions around suffering, theodicy, and things, in that that's not a settled scourge that we hope doesn't happen again, or something like that. That's an ongoing evil that we wrestle with as a culture, and I feel like it allows the end of that section where you talk about how faith functions in the midst of suffering to be a type of powerful statement that a lot of more traditional theodicies don't get around to developing.
Folk in the United States, like people around the world, will have some notions, some conception of what the good life is. Mm-hmm. Trying to define what makes life meaningful, what makes life worth living. And sometimes we operate on these type of cultural ideas and concepts that has actually been played out. When it's played out, it's not always as neat as the narrative is actually told. The good life, we talk about, say, freedom, we talk about opportunity. It hasn't been evenly enjoyed or evenly distributed in the country. So when we want to engage this type of experience in the United States, it helps us to have a more realistic understanding of who we are and what our history has been. And it hasn't always been pleasant, and it's been very difficult and hard. And the harshness or the hardness has come in certain ways to certain groups of people. And it's conceivable that with the demographics changing, it might be a different set of persons who experience the hardship some decades into the future. And so we might be learning quite differently in the future, looking at the experiences of other groups of persons, where we're looking today, what is it like for people to migrate over hundreds or thousands of miles, seeking to find a certain quality of life that they cannot have where they presently reside. Human beings have always been on the move and migrated. Some migrations have been forced, such as many Africans who came to the New World. That was a forced migration. And then you have migrations that have been coerced in such a way where circumstances have been such that it has compelled people to move and to go into other areas of the world. So in the future, when we think about life in America, we may look at another demographic group in order to try to understand what is life like in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And it's not always represented very well by those who are the most successful and those who are the rich and famous. But you have some who are poor and are unknown. And in order to get a good sense of what life is like in this nation around the world, we have to look at it not just with the extremes of what is life like for the British royalty. They don't represent the vast majority of people that are in the world. The common condition of human beings yet remains poverty. As it was in Jesus' time, it's like that for us today. The common condition is poverty. Mm-hmm. And for those of us who enjoy a little bit of measure above that, have an obligation and a responsibility to work on the behalf of those who don't have the resources. And sometimes we receive too much, and we all get more than what we deserve. So as we talk about evil and suffering and theodicy, it gets more complex, but it's also more enriching when we bring all of these aspects of the human experience together and reflect upon it theologically.
So how do you understand the notion, or how do you understand faith in the midst of the open question of theodicy, black suffering, ongoing history of oppression? How does faith take a different shape when the question is an ever-present one?
He says the question. He says faith is never. He says ever present.
Or how does the in the book, when you talk about the question of redemptive suffering, and then you put the question of redemptive suffering and theodicy in the midst of history, in the midst of what's inherited and where we're going in this movement to try to bring more freedom and things, faith then happens without having theodicy settled or justice established. And it happens in a context where the good life is not available in the same way for everyone. So, like what? Yeah.
Well, in that part of the book where I go into that discussion, I like to follow the lead or the insight of Victor Anderson, and he uses this concept, what he calls creative exchange, where it's not always choosing faith over doubt. It's not always that, let me see if I can represent him well or represent him better. When you have various situations that occur, there are various possibilities or alternatives that are presented to people. So it's not as if someone is trying to bring faith out of the suffering, but along with that, you have this type of mix of things together, and you can choose in a given situation to either face it with faith or you can face it with despair. And I like the way that he frames it, where you get into certain situations and it represents your choice. And again, it's going back to that very essential nature of the human being, that you have freedom. Mm-hmm. And that in the exercise of your freedom, you choose faith as opposed to despair when you confront it with various types of situations.
Mm-hmm. So how would you introduce Christology? If someone had you in and they wanted you to lecture on Christology in African American theology, what are the primary touch points for it?
To talk about Christology, wow. Well, first, I think that's the starting place. If we don't get that right, we don't get anything right at all. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm doing a course in African American theology at a Lutheran seminary in Philadelphia, and it has a focus on Christology. And the way I've done in the course is to create certain touch points, which is the incarnation. You know, what does it mean when we say that God is in the flesh? And how does this Jewishness of Jesus give us some insight into how God uses ethnicity for a salvific purpose? Another touchstone would be in terms of the religion of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus. Another area to touch upon is cross and resurrection. And what do those things mean? To understand suffering and how suffering becomes a byproduct of the type of commitment that he makes to a vision that he has of human community. So he's driven by this vision of the kingdom of God, and he follows this vision of the kingdom of God, and it leads him to a point of dying for it. So I always say, well, death by itself is not salvation, but it's death given, was the life that's actually given for this particular purpose. So I think cross and resurrection, that is, he suffers tremendously in pursuit of the vision, the kingdom of God, but his life is also vindicated through resurrection, and the resurrection opens a possibility for us as well in terms of renewal and life that goes beyond, life beyond the death that is experienced in the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the areas that I touch upon when I have done Christology for this course in African American theology.
So when you think of the American church in all of its different expressions, from Catholic to Pentecostal, Protestantism, to the different ways in which churches can be still so many congregations remain in a single race, and then you have denominations to trying to develop multi-ethnic churches in different ways. Mm-hmm. And when last semester when I was teaching a series of different texts on doctrine of God from different kind of schools of thought, one of the questions that kept coming up in the students, especially when reading Black theology and liberation theology, and then looking at the congregations, is how to understand the role of race plays in the individual community that they go to lead. Is there something gained by preserving the unique voices of churches where the membership remains predominantly one ethnic group, or is that desire for the more privileged people in the room for a more diverse one, a diverse church, a way of not really dealing with the problem? Or is the ecosystem of the churches one where we need different expressions? How do you frame that? Because there's in the book you give a very beautiful picture of the Black church having a very strong sense of identity and consciousness, and I wonder if a lot of the remedies white church leaders may want end up, creating a context that it doesn't preserve its own unique voice.
I think that, I can't speak for God, but if I'm allowed to offer a few words for God, I would say that in God's own words, God would say that I'm not colorblind, but I've created a world with a lot of diversity in it. And we have had a very difficult time dealing with diversity. And we're in a stage in American society where we value diversity per se. Well, we say we value diversity, but we're driven more by this type of policy around color blindness. Mm-hmm. That we don't want to see color, or we say that we have somehow achieved a great moral accomplishment by not seeing the differences that exist between us. Some of the differences that exist between us are not always around inequities. They're just simply differences that are in the world. You have people that are in different areas of the country. And if you live in the United States, you know there's a difference between New England and the Midwest. There's a difference between Northwest and the Southeastern states. There's a difference between the Mississippi Delta and those who are in Los Angeles. There's a lot of differences, and the differences are not always around inequities. Sometimes the race or ethnicity can play a crucial role in terms of stimulating, maybe becoming a catalyst to spread gospel, where the gospel spreads across a cultural vein, or maybe the gospel spreads across social connections that people have. And in that way, you have the gospel, proclamation of gospel that is using something else as a surrogate in order to promote itself. So when I look at an African-American church, I see gospel spreading through the surrogacy of race and ethnicity. Because you have people that already socially are connected, gospel can spread through those social networks. Where it becomes problematic is when persons of any race or ethnicity, when they form a church and it has a type of homogeneity to it, that they're not opening themselves up to other people. So in one sense, we want to use race and ethnicity as a surrogate in order to promote gospel. Here's a social networks that we can use in order to further the message. It's very much if you are broadcasting and you're using the technology to broadcast, and maybe it's nothing that you created yourself, but you're using that network, you're using the internet. You didn't create it, you didn't make it, but it's something that you can use in order to spread a message. And I think race and ethnicity works that way. Culture works that way, that we can use it as a surrogate in order to further this type of message. Where the message falls short is when persons of an ethnicity or race have not risen to the greater possibility of openness to others in the human experience. And the next work that I hope to complete sometime soon deals with ethnic consciousness. And how do we, first of all, understand ethnic consciousness and how God uses it? So you have someone like Abraham, who's the great patriarch of the Jewish people. And the promise that God gives to Abraham is that I'll make you into a great nation, and all the nations through you will be blessed. So God is using that particularity in order to spread a possibility to people well beyond just Jewish people. So when the gospel comes to me in the Black church, it is liberating. It's transformative. But it also should open me to the possibility of embracing others in the human experience. That's where I see gospel making its next contribution, if it makes one to us at all, is when you have various racial and ethnic groups who have this type of solidarity around Christian faith, will yet continue maybe to maintain their patterns of social organization, but to see, well, how do I, as a Black congregation, how do we as a Black congregation relate to people who are not Black? That's when we make the next big step. So at the congregation that I'm a member of, that I attend in the Washington, D.C. area, it has undergone a certain type of demographic shift in that area. In the early 70s, there was white flight, and you had several Blacks who moved into the neighborhood. Then there was another demographic shift where Blacks there in large numbers went farther out into the suburbs. Now you have another demographic shift where you have various Hispanic groups who have come into the neighborhood. And so you have a Black church that's sitting in a neighborhood that is predominantly Hispanic. And it represents a great challenge. How do we, as a Black church, reach out to persons who are not Black? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a challenge for us. So it's not only looking at, say, how do white churches deal with diversity, but you also have Black churches that are struggling with diversity as well. And then another way that ethnicity becomes even more complicated for us is with the large number of Blacks who immigrate from Africa and from the Caribbean. At one time when Africans and Caribbeans came to the United States, they assimilated into existing Black churches. But now they have come in such large numbers where they can reorder and reorganize the patterns of community. And so they create their own separate churches now. So this meaning of Black church now has become much more complicated. It's not just Black church in terms of African Americans, but it's Black church in terms of those who are African immigrants, mm-hmm. those who are the Black Caribbean immigrants. It's much more complicated now. But where all Christian churches, I think, move to the next level is to see how they have, after they have created the type of solidarity between themselves, how can they be more open to others? Because I think that's the mandate that the gospel gives to all of us. And ethnicity is one way that all human beings organize. Mm-hmm. I think ethnicity is more central to even political organization. Of course, I have to give a little bit more, put a little bit more research behind that to make the argument. But I think ethnicity is the basic category by which human beings organize themselves, where even over geopolitical boundaries, you have ethnic groups that exist over geopolitical boundaries. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the geopolitical boundaries don't always neatly contain ethnic groups. The ethnic groups actually expand beyond geopolitical boundaries. So there's family and family networks, and family networks merge into a higher pattern of organization, which is ethnic group. And I think where we are moving towards, if we're going to move to the next level, is to see how we can address how these various ethnic groups can be more open. And that's the struggle that we have in the world today. You have this type of tension between various human groups, whether it's political groups or whether it's ethnic groups, and then some use politics as a surrogate for ethnic. That's the way some Americans can think of themselves, not so much as an ethnic group, but a political group. Mm-hmm. And this political group takes on a certain quality as being ethnic. So when you ask certain Americans or people in the United States what ethnic group they belong to, some will say, oh, my ancestry is German. Some will say my ancestry is African. But you have some that will say my ancestry is actually American. It's a very interesting way that we self-identify and consider what we belong, the group that we belong to. Mm-hmm. But the challenge, I think, if these groups are embracing Christianity, there's a mandate to become more open and develop better relationships to those who are beyond our ethnic group.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very helpful. I will be looking forward to seeing the published version of it when you finish up. Mm-hmm. So one more question I have for you is as a theologian educating future ministers, what question do you hope their time in the classroom with you makes them keep asking throughout their time as a minister?
Mm-hmm. Well, being in theological education for some time, I'm always happy this time of the year because we finished an academic year, we're going into the summer break, and I can rest and relax. And graduation is a happy time when I see students who have finished their course of study. But more important than the mastery of the subject matter is the question of integrity. Not so much what you know, but who you are. What type of person are you? So I hope in all of my teaching and the writing, it will raise for people that fundamental question. Who are you? And along with that question of who are you, carries with it another question of how you relate to others in a way that conveys moral integrity. And I've had some students who have struggled academically through the course, and they've turned out to be the greatest ministers. Mm-hmm. And then I've had some who have sailed through it with very little strenuous effort at all. They're just really brilliant, smart people, and they will do good in anything they put their minds to. But they have fallen short when it comes to moral integrity. So the most important question is, who are we and how we relate to others? And that's key. One, I mentioned earlier, my former professor, Sallie McFague. She's done a lot of publication in eco-theology. And some years ago, I came across an essay that she wrote, How My Mind Has Changed, or what would I do if I went back to do it all over again? And I was surprised to see that she said the topic that she would want to take on now is an anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And along with that, how do we relate to each other and to other living beings that are in our world? Mm-hmm. And I think that might be a very good intuition about where we should be going next in terms of our theology, because we're at a point where there are no new continents to conquer. We're here now on the planet, and as Martin Luther King said, we have to learn to live together or we will die as fools. We'll either learn to live together as brothers or sisters, or we'll die apart as fools. We're at a point now where crucial to our survival is developing a better relationship with between ourselves and also our environment.
Definitely. Well, that was a very, very beautiful challenge. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk and be on the podcast for writing the text. And it's been a real treat and a real honor.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this, and I hope that it will encourage some persons to read the work if they haven't read it, and maybe go well beyond what I've done in terms of my work and venture into some new areas where it could be very beneficial and productive for us in terms of doing Christian theology today. Mm-hmm.